quitting the Council. The U.S. exits a UN agency accusing it of bias. Is the United Nations failing, or is America abandoning human rights to protect itself and Israel? I'm Emmerson Mnangagwa, and today's newsmaker is the UN Human Rights Council. A cesspool of political bias. That's what the U.S. called the UN human rights body as Nikki Haley announced America's withdrawal from the Council. For more than a decade, the agency set up to protect human rights has repeatedly been accused of failing to do so. Last year, a group of British lawyers started a campaign to remove Saudi Arabia, since it's consistently ranked as one of the world's top executioners. And they're not the only members with a worrying human rights record. Burundi, Egypt, and China, they're all members too. So, does the UN agency need to reform? And was the US heroic or hypocritical in pulling out? Shoaib Hassan reports.
It was a decision the United States says it's taken after great deliberation. Its withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council.
Human rights abusers continue to serve on and be elected to the Council. The world's most inhumane regimes continue to escape scrutiny. And the Council continues politicizing and scapegoating of countries with positive human rights records in an attempt to distract from the abusers in their ranks. Therefore, as we said we would do a year ago, if we did not see any progress, the United States is officially withdrawing from the UN Human Rights Council.
Another reason cited by US officials for their exit was what they called the Council's mistreatment of their close ally, Israel. Specifically, they say Israel is unfairly targeted for its treatment of Palestinians under occupation, with Israel censored for more than any other country. The UN founded the Human Rights Council in 2006 with the aim of promoting and protecting human rights around the world. It has 47 members, some of whom have questionable human rights records, like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Venezuela, and another close US ally, Saudi Arabia. For many, the timing seems suspicious. Many countries have been criticizing the US border policy of separating families fleeing violence in Central America and deporting the parents while detaining their children in special centers. President Trump has now signed an order to keep families together, but not before causing further damage to America's claim to any moral high ground.
The irony is not lost on anyone. They're pulling out of a body that technically could hold an emergency session, try to call them to task, ask them what's going on, have a discussion about the abuses that are happening on the southwest border. They can still do this even if the United States is there, but the U.S. may no longer be present. The credibility of the United States as a promoter and defender of human rights is lost in a way that I don't think it has been in many, many years.
Has the US then done itself and its allies greater damage by leaving the UN body? Or does it reduce the clout of the UN, as critics say it's fast losing its relevance? Shoaib Hassan, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Washington by Brett Schaefer. He's a foreign policy expert at the Heritage Foundation. Also in Washington is Ted Picone. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a former advisor in the Clinton administration. And completing our panel in London, we have Rosa Friedman. She's a professor of law, conflict and global development at the University of Reading. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers. Brett Schaefer, let me start with you. Is the UN Human Rights Council really a cesspool of political bias, as Nikki Haley says it is, or rather a more honest interpretation is that maybe the United States is on the wrong side of history here?
Oh, I think the second comment that you made is entirely inaccurate. I wouldn't necessarily call the Human Rights Council a cesspool of bias, but it's unavoidable and absolutely true that it is a biased organization in terms of its treatment of Israel. About approximately half of the Human Rights Council's condemnatory resolutions have been focused on Israel. It has never passed a condemnatory resolution on countries with notorious human rights violations like Cuba, China, Zimbabwe, Saudi Arabia, and others. So its focus is off. Absolutely, Ambassador Haley is correct about that. And she's right to call it on that. And I don't think any honest observer of the Human Rights Council would deny that the Council's treatment of Israel is disproportionate and way out of balance in terms of the human rights violations committed by other countries.
Okay, so Rosa Friedman, what's happening at the UN Human Rights Council is that they're focusing solely on the crimes or alleged crimes of Israel and not on anybody else, because other countries do terrible things as well, and that's why the US is right to pull out, according to Brett Schaefer. Your response to that is what?
I'm not sure that's what Brett Schaefer was saying, actually. He was saying that there's excessive and disproportionate scrutiny of Israel. Of course, the Human Rights Council is focused on many other situations, and its focus on those situations has gone up to the Security Council and to many other parts of the UN. But where you have excessive and disproportionate scrutiny, you have Israel being focused on more than Yemen, Syria, North Korea, South Sudan, Sudan itself, and many others combined. And that, of course, delegitimizes the body. It doesn't take away from the fact that the body does very good work on other areas, but it feeds into the hands of those who want to discredit it or those who want to pull out of it, like the Trump administration.
Okay, so Ted Picone, can we have both? Can we say that the US is wrong to pull out, but that the UN Human Rights Council is also hypocritical?
I think that's where I'm coming out on this. I mean, we have a long experience with how to work effectively at the Human Rights Council. We've seen what it looks like when the U.S. withdraws and when the U.S. engages. And when the U.S. engages and it really exercises its pressure and leverage with other states, we do get a more effective body. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. Will it ever be perfect? No. I think that's a complete idealistic point of view that some people have in the Trump administration. But what we have to do is deal with the real world. And in the real world, it's a matter of political will. And are states willing to step up and make the council an effective body? And I think we have seen cases where it has, and in cases where it has fallen down. And I think you have to be engaged and fight the fight to get more wins than losses at the council.
Brett Schaefer, I wonder what you think about what the Human Rights Watch director Ken Roth had to say. He said the Trump administration's withdrawal is a sad reflection of its one-dimensional human rights policy. Defending Israeli abuses from criticism takes precedence above all else. What do you think?
Well, I think quite simply he's wrong. I think the United States is rightly concerned about the mistreatment of Israel in the Human Rights Council, but the United States was also disappointed in the Council's failure to address human rights abuses in other serious situations around the world, as my other colleagues have admitted, and acknowledged that the Council has failed to address situations in Syria, situations in Yemen, and situations in North Korea to the same extent that they focus on Israel, and that's right.
But does that...
Now, that being said...
Hold on for a second.
Nobody expects the Council to be perfect.
Right.
But yes.
Certainly. Isn't there an element of whataboutery that just because they might be unfair in their treatment of Israel, it doesn't mean that the Israelis shouldn't be condemned for gunning down unarmed protesters at the border?
No one is saying that Israel should be immune from scrutiny. That's not what we're saying. But there's a fact of just reality that the Council has one agenda item focused on Israel and one agenda item focused on every other country in the world. And that is just a disproportionate allocation of the Council's resources, its time, its effort, and its attention. So I don't think that Israel should be immune from scrutiny from the Human Rights Council at all. Israel does not think that Israel should be immune from scrutiny from the Human Rights Council. But when the Council's attention, time, and resources are focused so disproportionately in Israel, it legitimately takes away the attention that should be given to these other very serious human rights situations around the world. So it's not just about the bias against Israel, but it's also the Council's failure to address these other very serious human rights situations in places that deserve and need the scrutiny that the Council does not give it.
Rosa, would you prefer to have the U.S. at the table, have the argument at the table, rather than throw the baby out with the bathwater?
Well, if we look at how the U.S. engaged at the beginning of the Council, it voted...
Brett, that's for Rosa. Go ahead, Rosa.
Sorry, I think if we look at the way that the US engaged at the beginning of the Council, they voted against it, but they funded it and they engaged with it. And obviously under Obama, they came back to the table quite publicly. I think what we have to acknowledge is that Trump, as president, doesn't want to engage with human rights or with climate change or with maternal health care or with any issues really that aren't about military force or about wealth and prosperity and wealth creation. So he is withdrawing from these multilateral institutions or multilateral agreements, citing different reasons for it to appeal to a populist national audience. But really what's at the heart of this is not about Trump not liking the Human Rights Council or being pro-Israel. It's about Trump wanting to be exceptionist and unilateralist and dragging the US far outside of the arena. Ultimately, there will be other states that fill that vacuum, some of them who are anti-human rights, like China or Russia, and some of them who are very pro-human rights from Latin America, South Africa, the European Union. Yes, it would be great to have the US at the table. Yes, they will be missed, but the Human Rights Council will continue regardless. My worry is more for the United States, what will happen to it from it withdrawing from all these institutions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And a lot of people are saying that this is a pattern with the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Accords, the Iran nuclear deal, and so forth. Ted, let me pick up on something that Rosa said. Who fills that vacuum at the UN Human Rights Council? Will we see a situation where the likes of China get to then shape the human rights narrative at home when it comes to Tibet and Xinjiang and elsewhere? And then, I don't know, does it become much worse if China's calling the shots?
Well, I think it will become worse if you look at China's own record on human rights. Their objective is to protect and defend their system of government, which inherently abuses human rights. And so China, in the last couple of years, we've seen step up its activism at the Human Rights Council and across other UN institutions as it feels more confident on the world stage. And those initiatives had tended to be kind of soft and easy language, but in fact are a hidden agenda to undermine the core principles of the international human rights regime. And I think that's really threatening. And if the US is not there, if not winning those votes, at least calling them out on it, which it did in the last session in March, we're running into trouble. I want to make another point about Brett's comment about immunity. I mean, no country should be immune from human rights scrutiny, including the United States. And I think that's really what is eating away at the Trump administration here. They don't want to be subject to the kind of scrutiny that the Human Rights Council subjects every single country to through this universal peer review process. And I think in the comments in particular by Secretary of State Pompeo, he talks about sovereignty and the importance of shielding ourselves from this kind of scrutiny. And I think that's fundamentally not in the U.S. interest.
Okay, then that's a good opportunity for me to pivot to the U.S. particularly. Brett, is it true that the U.S. does not want a mirror shoved in its face? We've got Zaid Ra'ad al-Hussein, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, calling what's happening on the border where kids are being separated from their parents. Some of the kids, we don't know where they are, calling it government-sanctioned child abuse. Is that just a coincidence, or is this connected that the U.S. doesn't want scrutiny vis-a-vis its own human rights record?
I think it's completely unrelated, to be honest with you. I've been working with people in the Obama administration. I've been working with people in the Trump administration. I worked with people in the Bush administration. All of them acknowledged the flaws of the council. All of them sought to try and change things. First, in the initial resolution creating the council under the Bush administration in 2006, they tried to establish membership standards and other procedures to try and strengthen the council to avoid the problems that beset the commission before it. The Obama administration tried to implement a number of different reforms in the 2011 review process. They failed as well. And the Trump administration over the past 17 months has also tried to engage with other countries, other human rights groups, to try and promote reforms addressing both the anti-Israel bias and also the membership of the council itself, the election procedures and other reforms to try and improve the quality of the council membership. They also engaged in procedural reform in an effort to try and streamline the council's agenda, make sure it's more efficient, more effective, doesn't consume nearly as much time and resources as it currently does. In all of those areas, over the past 17 months, the member states said, yes, these are very serious problems. The human rights group said, yes, these are very serious problems, yet there was no progress made in actually addressing any of those different items over the past 17 months. So it's not as if the Trump administration just looked at the criticism that it was getting for the Mexican border situation a couple weeks ago and currently and decided to leave the Human Rights Council. This has been an ongoing effort by the Trump administration to try and reform the council, and it's an ongoing effort that extends through multiple U.S. administrations. Unfortunately, we've failed repeatedly to achieve any significant reform of the Council to make it a better institution than the Commission before it, which even Kofi Annan said cast a shadow over the reputation of the United Nations.
Rosa, is it unfair to connect the two, what's happening on the border with the withdrawal from the UN Human Rights Council?
Let's be clear, the United States is not party to very many international human rights conventions or treaties or agreements. Indeed, the United States takes an exceptionalist approach whereby it wants other countries to become party to them, to become bound by legal obligations, but it doesn't want encroachment on its state sovereignty. And again, the US, at the time of creating the Council, wanted the Council to be made in the image it wanted, otherwise it was going to take its ball and go home and vote against this body. What we've seen with the Trump administration is that it has failed to understand how the diplomacy works behind the scenes in the way that Obama and Bush and all the previous administrations did. There was plenty of diplomatic progress on reforming the Council, and indeed the Council will be reformed in the next couple of years. By walking away from the table, the US no longer has the same buy-in or the same power or influence on that reform progress. What really happened, which many people in Geneva know and many people outside Geneva ought to know, is that the US floated a resolution far too early on reform. They hadn't found enough cross-regional support for that reform. There was a pushback from NGOs, including Human Rights Watch, and from some member states. And the US, instead of staying and trying to renegotiate and refocus, decided, as it's done with many of these other multilateral institutions and many other agreements, that it was simply going to walk away. That is not the way to do diplomacy. That is not the way to run a country. And that's certainly not the way to work in the international forum where there are 193 member states and every state's vote is equal to one another.
Very powerfully put. Ted Picone, how is this going to play out within the US and with regards the United States and the responsibility it has to not be a human rights abuser?
Well, I think it only further politicizes the human rights agenda in our own domestic politics. We've seen over the last several years a fair amount of bipartisan support for effective action at the Council, recognizing its flaws, but even understanding that it has so many positive attributes, and it has taken really serious action on a number of issues, whether it's North Korea or Syria or Eritrea or Burundi, where they dispatch fact finders and investigators to these places. Experts are calling out those leaders and calling Kim Jong-un, committing crimes against humanity publicly. I think that makes a pretty clear case for the Council being an effective body on calling out abusers. But back home, I think we get into this Israel politics issue, which has tended to skew the analysis of the Council and its effectiveness, and to I think, U.S. interest detriment. I mean, we should call out the bias against Israel, absolutely. But I think we're walking away and leaving a lot of important aspects on the table just to defend Israel and our own sovereignty. And I think that's a big mistake. I don't think that's how you exercise leadership on human rights in the world. You stay and you fight and you engage.
Stay and fight and engage, Brett. Isn't that a fair argument?
Well, the U.S. has been involved in the Council under the Obama administration the first year and a half under the Trump administration. You take a look at the resolutions that have passed, very few of them are decided by one vote, whether that's the United States or any other country. In fact, I look back over the past few years, none of them have been decided by any fewer than 5 votes. So this is more of a either a voice vote on the resolutions or votes of a fairly significant margin, 5 votes out of the 47 members of the Council. So the U.S. being there obviously had an impact. I think that the United States could have an impact while it was there, but it's also a fact that other countries can and should step up to fill in that void. Otherwise, what is the Council? If the Council can't operate or can't be effective or can't be a voice on human rights without the United States being there, being the leader, then how strong is the institution itself? And we shouldn't confuse the fact that the Council actually can take action here. The Human Rights Council has no authority whatsoever to implement sanctions, to take any kind of decisive action on the countries themselves. It merely is a naming and shaming institution. And unfortunately, in way too many cases, the Council is even unable to name and shame countries for the deplorable human rights records that you have. You mentioned earlier about China. The Council has never passed a condemnatory resolution against China. So those that are concerned about China stepping forward and trying to change the perception of Tibet or change the perception of its own human rights abuses domestically, well, the Council hasn't been a voice for that since in the 12 years of its existence.
Okay, I'll let that be the final word. It's been really good getting all your thoughts, Brett Schaefer, Ted Picone and Rosa Friedman. I thank you all sincerely for coming on to the Newsmakers. Still to come on the Newsmakers, legal cannabis comes to Canada. Will the cash crop dismantle the black market or cause harm to society? And Zimbabwe's president survives an explosion at his own political rally. Could violence interfere with elections next month? Since 2001, Canadians have been able to smoke marijuana for medicinal purposes, but soon everyone will be able to get high for fun, and it'll all be completely legal. Canada is set to become the second ever country to legalize the drug for recreational use, fulfilling a campaign promise made by Justin Trudeau. He says for too long, it's been too easy for children to access marijuana and for criminals to reap the profits. And legislation is meant to change all that. But critics warn it's a public health time bomb. Here's Christine Pirovalakis.
We will soon have a new system in place, one that keeps cannabis out of the hands of our kids and keeps profits away from organized crime.
Canadians will soon be allowed to smoke and sell recreational marijuana freely. Only the second country in the world to make pot legal nationwide. Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act, was approved by the Canadian Senate last week. Adults are expected to be able to start buying it in October. While the new law establishes a national framework for how the cannabis market will operate, each province will be allowed to set their own legal age of consumption, decide how marijuana will be sold, whether users can smoke in public, and whether to ban homegrown weed. Depending on the province, Bill C-45 would allow people aged 18 or 19 to purchase and consume marijuana legally from authorized suppliers. The bill will allow adults to carry and share up to 30 grams of marijuana and can grow up to 4 plants at home.
So in no way do we think this is going to be any different than with people, perhaps making wine in their home or growing tobacco in their home. So I think we have to trust Canadians that they are going to be doing so responsibly.
The sale of marijuana for medical use has been legal in Canada since 2001. Canadians are among the world's heaviest users of marijuana, according to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime. And Ottawa hopes that by legalizing pot under a regulated system, it will take the drug off the streets and keep the profits out of the hands of drug cartels.
A large portion of the population consume cannabis and obtain it on the black market. The main idea behind the legalization project is to break up the black market and keep young people away from early consumption.
Uruguay was the first country in the world to approve the recreational use of cannabis in 2013. 9 U.S. states have done so as well. But Canada is the first leading economy to do this nationwide.
I think that it's great that people are going to have the ability to just not be paranoid or worried and just walk in, buy a little bit of marijuana, consume it on your own good, and you're not doing anyone wrong.
While campaigning in 2015, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau promised to legalize marijuana. And Trudeau has acknowledged he smoked a joint with friends 5 or 6 times. According to Statistics Canada, the market is worth $4.5 billion. And the federal government and the provinces hope to profit from the added tax revenue, which could be at least $1 for every gram sold. But many questions remain unanswered. Authorities have said driving while under the influence of cannabis will not be tolerated, but they admit there's no accepted way to easily test motorists. While the Canadian government is determined to provide recreational marijuana legally, is there a risk of making pot more accessible to children and people prone to drug abuse? Christine Pirovalakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Toronto is Tony Dean. He's an independent Canadian senator who was instrumental in getting the new legislation passed. And in Regina, we have Denise Batters. She's a senator for Canada's Conservative Party and an outspoken critic of the decision to legalize recreational marijuana. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Tony Dean, let me start with you. You worked hard to push this through. Tell me why.
Well, we've had significant challenges with cannabis in Canada for quite some time, and it became clear that 95 years of prohibition wasn't working. We have the highest rate of youth consumption globally, and adults are relatively high users in this country as well. All of that drug is drawn from a $7 billion illegal market in Canada, which is not tested for potency or contaminants. We're particularly worried about the impact of cannabis on the health of young people, and also the social impacts of criminalisation for relatively small amounts of possession. So we had a newly elected government 3 years ago that decided that legalisation and strict regulation was the better route. I thought that might be the right idea, but certainly over the last several months of examination of the legislation in the Senate, it seemed to me that it's far better and far more likely to be successful than prohibition. So I was happy to be the sponsor of this legislation in Canada's Senate.
Right. Denise Batters, prohibition doesn't work. That's the message from Tony Dean. Tell me why you disagree.
Well, what we have actually in Canada is legalization, which goes a fair bit further than decriminalization, which I think a lot more Canadians would have been on board with. I think that this is the wrong way to go. We're the only second country in the entire world, Uruguay being the first, to take this particular route. And the way that this government has gone about it, they've done it in too rushed of a fashion. We have had so many people telling them that they're not ready to implement. Provinces, police, municipalities, Indigenous groups, all of these different people have continued to say that we're not ready. Plus, they've done it in a fashion where they say that their goal is to protect children, yet they've imposed a minimum age of only 18 years old. They've allowed home cultivation, which puts that illegal drug in the homes of children, too easy to access. They haven't allowed enough safeguards. I think that it's too rushed. We're not ready yet. And this government has continued to push through just to have a political deadline met and to make one of their election promises actually finally stick, because they've broken several of them.
Tony, let me bring up someone who agrees with Denise and disagrees with you, and it's a nation state, Russia. Russia says this is a breach of Canada's international legal obligations. Is that true?
Well, technically it is true, but I take the position, and I think I'm supported by many others in this, in saying that with respect to cannabis, the country wasn't doing very well in living up to its obligations to tackle the problems of cannabis in Canada, when we're one of the largest consuming nations in the world. That doesn't signal success. So I think that certainly my view is that we will have a far stronger likelihood of being able to tackle cannabis and its harms and the $7 billion illegal market by legalizing and strictly regulating the drug. I think that decriminalization is always an option, and some US states have taken that approach. But of course, decriminalization replaces jail time in many cases for small offences with ticketing, but it doesn't eradicate or start to tackle the massive illegal market that we have in Canada. That stays in place, and that is the main failing of the decriminalisation approach. Look, we have to our south 9 US states and the District of Columbia, who, having had a medical regime, have now moved to recreational cannabis regimes. One of those states, California, has a population that is larger than Canada's. So yes, we are the second national state to legalise, but there are more than a few states to our south, closer to home, who've gone down this road, and we've learned from some of their experience and some of their mistakes in designing a quite cautious and prudent approach to the legalisation and regulation of cannabis.
And Denise, looking at some of those states, a lot of them point to the positives being that they can tax marijuana and they get good money that they can use to build schools and hospitals and so forth. Why not replace a $7 billion illegal industry that's lining the pockets of criminals with a $4 billion legal industry where tax money could be put to good use?
Well, what we've heard actually, and I made a trip to Washington, D.C. a couple of months ago to get straight answers because we weren't getting those answers from the Trudeau government and their ministers in Canada. So we went to Washington, D.C. to speak directly to people high up in the U.S. administration and also to speak to people that have had those actual examples in states where they have legalized, and we heard some very alarming things, including about how Colorado, where they have allowed home cultivation, that's a really major problem, and for this government to say that it's strictly regulating, yet they're allowing every single household in Canada to have 4 plants. And what we've heard is that is a way that the black market has used in Colorado to expand the black market. And so Colorado is actually the #1 black market in the US, even though they have a legalized market. So my major concern continues to be, you might get a small amount of tax dollars to go to hospitals and education, but what we should really be trying to do is protect children, especially when we know that marijuana has such major mental health impacts on the developing brains of youth. And that's why we had major medical organizations saying we should have a much higher minimum age.
Yeah, and I'd love to have this debate again with doctors looking at the medical side of things, where we look at it, whether it's a slippery slope or not. That's really interesting. Tony Dean, very finally, are you worried about what might happen with the United States, given that if we look at the other country that's gone down this route, Uruguay, many US banks are not doing business with Uruguayan banks. They have these federal regulations against drug trafficking and so forth. They've got drug war legislation intact. Are you worried that somehow, bilaterally, Canada's relationship with the United States is going to get soured because of the legalization of marijuana?
I'm not at all, and the main reason for that is about 1/3 of American citizens are now living in states that either have medical or recreational cannabis. So in the US, the cannabis legalization and regulation has moved faster and further than in Canada. We are taking a much more precautionary approach. And I think we've seen signs recently of the president in the US starting to signal that he may be taking a laxer approach and recognizing the ability of US states to move to legal regimes. I think this is a movement that probably is difficult to stop now, certainly in the US. Other countries will make their own determination about whether they want to go there or not. But I'm not concerned about Canada's relationship with the United States. In some respects, we're followers rather than out front of them.
Okay. Tony Dean and Denise Batters, I thank you both for joining us here on the Newsmakers. Let's bring in 2 new guests now. From Toronto, we have Jodie Emery. She's a cannabis activist, civil liberties advocate, and public speaker for Cannabis Culture magazine and Pot TV. In Vancouver, we have Pamela McCall. She's a campaigner against legalized marijuana and a member of Clear the Air Now, part of a national coalition opposing the law. Pamela, let's start with you. Tell me why you're against this. Why is it such a big problem for you?
Well, I represent 87% of Canadians who don't use marijuana. I also represent the world's population who don't use marijuana, which is the vast majority of people. There's been very good reasons why this drug has not been legalized around the world. And, I just listened to everything Senator Tony Dean just said, and everything that he just said was pure propaganda. I mean, it is not based in fact. The fact that we have in America, California and different states going to legalization, he didn't tell you that there's also an immense pushback. In Colorado, over 80% of the towns and cities have now bans in place, not allowing it. California, it's around 70% bans. The public, when they start to realize the mistake of legalization and what this does to their communities, they're pushing back, as they've done in Holland and other places around the world. And that's exactly what happened in 1992 when parents realized a generation had gone to marijuana from late 1970s to 1992, and they pushed back, and they elected Ronald Reagan. So the power of the people, if you want to talk about social activism, I am a social activist. Jody Emery, your other guest, is not a social activist. She's a capitalist. She makes money off selling marijuana. And she pleaded guilty to trafficking charges last year. She sells marijuana to make money.
Okay, well,
the other thing that Tony Dean mentioned,
hold on for a second. Okay,
Canada
so
has a high rate of use.
So let's get
the problem.
Yeah, let's get Jody to defend himself here, because in a way I would have loved for you to be, locking horns with Tony Dean, but I don't want this to become you responding to everything Tony said. Let's get you to respond to what Jody says. But first, Jody, respond to what Pamela said about you. Go ahead, Jody.
Well, first of all, I've been a cannabis legalization activist since 2004. I was a magazine editor, and we never sold cannabis. Our first cannabis franchise opened in April 2016 after I ran for a Liberal nomination supporting the legalization campaign. I've been a political candidate for office 4 other times in the province of British Columbia. So I'm not making money off of cannabis. It was a civil disobedience activism campaign to demonstrate what legalization should look like. But I should note that it's interesting Pam is so concerned about cannabis when she admits she doesn't use it or even care for it. And in fact, when she says she represents all people who don't use cannabis, there are a great deal of people who don't use cannabis who do support cannabis law reform because they realize that the criminal law causes far more harm than cannabis has or ever will, and that the criminal law costs Canadians hundreds of millions of dollars every year to go after peaceful, non-violent citizens for consensual transactions and behaviors and activities. If Pam is so concerned about the devastation to society caused by drugs, why is she not campaigning to close down all of the alcohol distribution points and alcohol bars and government alcohol wholesalers who cause direct death and devastation, disease and crime every minute of every day when cannabis is used as medicine to help people?
Let's get a response then from Pamela. Right. So Pamela, look, just because, let me sort of add to that, and you can fold in your response with this. Let me add to that the question that just because you're in the majority doesn't necessarily make you right. Go ahead, Pam.
Well, the fact that Jody Emery just pivoted from legalization over to decriminalization, which I support. The fact that this legislation, if you sell marijuana to a minor, you're going to jail for 14 years. How is that liberal? How is that improving our drug laws? I find that draconian. I think that that's a terrible policy. I don't think that anyone should get 14 years.
We agree.
For selling a drug that they don't even think is harmful, So I think, hey, wait a minute, I'm talking now. So you also have self-proclaimed yourself as a capitalist, because I've listened to your interviews. You are a capitalist. You want legalization so you can make money. And you've been very annoyed that the industry, the big international pot industry that's taken over this country, you've been annoyed that you've been shut out of that now. Like, you set this up to make money. You want to make money from marijuana, so don't play the social activist thing. And when you're talking
Pamela,
about dead kids, there are more dead kids and harmed children from marijuana use than from prison.
Pamela, if we can move beyond whether Jody's making money out of this or not, it would be interesting to see if you could address her question about alcohol. Alcohol is arguably more destructive than marijuana. Do you have as much of a problem with that?
Well, arguably, you compare it, this is a talking point of the pot lobby. To do things about the argument with alcohol. 80% of people use alcohol. There is no way any government is ever going to prohibit it. It will never happen. Marijuana in Canada is 12%. We can keep it under control. We'd like to see it around 4%. That's a good goal for us. Not more people using, which is what the industry wants, what Jody Emery wants. When you're looking at alcohol and you're talking about comparing it with marijuana, you cannot do that without going and looking at specific cases. When was the last time you saw somebody die from secondhand smoke standing next to someone with a beer? You've got to look at it in individual cases, and you cannot make blanket statements that marijuana is safer than alcohol. That's just that's a talking point. It's a piece of propaganda.
Okay,
it's not true.
Jody,
you've got to look at Little Haven Dubois, 14-year-olds dead dead from marijuana use.
Come in, Jody.
Well, I would say let's pretend cannabis is as harmful as alcohol. Prohibiting it won't make it safer. Having tough laws won't make it safer. And lying about it won't make it safer. So if cannabis is indeed harmful, we can't make it safer by making people afraid of it or being tough on people for it. But I do have to note, Pam, you and I do agree that these tough new laws are ridiculous. And I find it a little surprising. I'm shocked, actually, that you're speaking exactly the same words I speak when we agree that the government here in Canada is actually passing tougher laws. We're moving from 8 offenses under the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act for cannabis to 45 new federal offenses with increased penalties, some of them going from 7-year maximums to 14-year maximums, which restricts judges' ability to hand out lesser sentences. And the government has pledged over $250 million federally for more marijuana law enforcement, and hundreds of millions of dollars provincially, and tens of millions in each city. We're actually seeing a new recriminalization of cannabis in many respects, and it is for the benefit of big corporate interests and former cops and politicians and industry insiders. And that's unfortunate, because we only see law reform coming because of peaceful civil disobedience. It's because of people who break the law openly and challenge it in court that the courts have ordered the government of Canada to provide more access. So the government is still talking about restrict and limit access to cannabis.
Well, I mean, you and I
talking
differ.
Points like Pam's to say it's dangerous.
Yeah.
Pam?
Well, I'll let Pam
It's
speak.
not a talking point that it's dangerous. We have 27,000 studies that substantiate the fact that it's not safe. Marijuana is not safe for human consumption. Fact of science. Absolutely. Look at Health Canada. Men should not use marijuana if they want to have children. That's the government of Canada, the government that just legalized this drug, says men should not use marijuana if they want to have children. And they legalized it. How do you do that and not repeat the whole experiment with thalidomide? How do you do that and not have the taxpayer now at jeopardy of being sued down the road when all these young men who don't know the risk of testicular cancer, of sterility, all these issues that can come with using high-potency marijuana, didn't know, and this government allowed them to go and buy this product. We, the taxpayers, are going to get sued down the road. And that's one of the reasons that this should not happen. But the main reason it shouldn't happen is that this drug is not safe for human consumption. Nobody should be touching this drug. And so my job is demand reduction. This is what you do. My job now is to tell people, don't use this stuff. Stay away from it. Stay out of a psychiatric ward. You know, don't touch this stuff.
Okay,
it
let me
is
give
terrible.
Jody
and
final
you've got
20
an
seconds.
industry who wants you to use it, just like tobacco.
Pam, we're out of time, but I want to give Jody a final response. 20 seconds, please, Jody.
Human beings have been using cannabis for thousands of years. Our bodies have the endocannabinoid system within. Our brain and our bodies are designed to receive cannabis. Cannabinoids are in mother's breast milk for babies. Thousands and thousands of years of research and science shows that cannabis is indeed safe. It reduces obesity. It improves lung health. It improves mental cognitive functioning. This is according to Harvard and researchers all over the world. You can see all of these studies in my testimony to the government and online.
Okay, I've got to wrap. Both of you, listen, I really appreciate you both taking the time to come on the Newsmakers. I'd love to have you both on again in the future, but I've got to move on for now. Pamela McCall and Jody Emery, thank you very much.
Sure.
These are my normal enemies, and the attempts have been so many. This is not the first attempt in my life. It doesn't, to me, it's normal.
Emmerson Mnangagwa may have had several attempts on his life, but perhaps none came as close as an explosion this past weekend. The Zimbabwean president was just meters away from a blast that rocked his political rally in Bulawayo. Mnangagwa escaped unharmed, but others were not so lucky. Several people were wounded, and so far 2 have died from their injuries. Next month, we'll see the first election since Robert Mugabe was forced from power. Mnangagwa vows the attack will not derail the vote. But opposition leader Nelson Chamisa isn't so sure, saying there could be more violence ahead. So, what can the government do to ensure stability? Let's ask the chairman of the UK chapter of Zimbabwe's ruling ZANU-PF party, Nick Mangwana. He joins us now from London. Thanks so much for joining us. Sir, let me ask you...
Thank you for having me.
First of all, let me ask you, was it absolutely clear to you and the party and the government that it was the president who was targeted in that explosion?
It is very clear, without any shadow of doubt, that the target of the bomb was the president and possibly the top leadership of the party as well, because the vice president was just a few meters away from him. Well, the two vice presidents. One of the vice presidents is still in hospital as I'm speaking to you now, being treated for his injuries. The president, one of the president's aides is one of the people that died, and one of the vice president's aides again is one of the people that died. So you can see how the inner circle this whole thing was. So yes, the president was the one to be taken out, but because of the indiscriminate nature of the explosive, I think they wanted to have many for one. So if they could take out the president plus ZANU-PF's top 4 or 6 people, then that would have been a very big harvest of the devil.
Right. And when you say they, who are you picturing? Who would want to do it and who would have the capability of doing it?
I'm not going to say anything more than the president has said, because it will be a bit irresponsible, knowing how much this brews tension and also knowing how much this can explode and interfere with investigations. But what the president has said in his official statement was that these are the same enemies that have attempted to kill him in the past. I think you remember that sometime last year, I think it was around the 8th of August or 12th of August, he was poisoned. And he had to be airlifted to South Africa for treatment. Yeah, so that is another attempt on his life. And he's saying it's the same enemies. His office was broken into quite a few times. I think it's about 6 times. And nobody knows what these people were trying to do. And this is supposed to be a very guarded office when he was vice president. And soon after his swearing in as vice president, his party office also was broken into. And one of the secretaries had poisoning from cyanide in there, and she was in hospital for quite a long time. And the person who was the target of this poisoning again was the president. It's only that this time round they've moved from poisoning and all other nefarious methods to exploding bombs or grenades, whatever it was, or explosives, indiscriminately.
Yeah, and I know you say it would be irresponsible for you to speculate as to who, but perhaps let me ask you then another side to this mystery and ask you about that and ask you the question in a different way. Why would they want to do that? Why would they want to kill President Mnangagwa?
It's very clear what President Mnangagwa is doing. He's transforming and reforming Zimbabwe. He has set in motion the Second Republic. One of the things that he has done is some 180-degree turns in policy. The policy thrust that was there before and where he's taking the country is completely different. And obviously, when situations like that happen, there are people that will be aggrieved. There are people that will not be happy. There are people that want the status quo to be maintained. And the likelihood, the very likelihood is this is the remnants from the old regime.
Elections around the corner. Zimbabweans are looking forward to those elections.
Correct.
July 30th. It's just around the corner. Big question marks about those elections now, given that the president was almost assassinated, right?
No, not at all.
Tell me why.
In every situation, there are always miscreants, fiends, and villains. People that will try to do some mischief making. Yes, targeting the president, the vice president, the party chairperson, the political commissar, and all those high-ranking officials. Yes, was an attempt at a very big scoop. But the fact still remains that Zimbabweans are resilient. Everything is going on. No political program, no campaign program is being affected in that sense. The day after this assassination attempt, the vice president was in Chitungwiza, a different town, campaigning before thousands and thousands of Zimbabweans who went there undeterred. The opposition leader was in Kadoma. The main opposition leader was in Kadoma, another town which is about 130 kilometers from Harare. Again, he was campaigning undeterred. He held a few meetings there. The First Lady was also holding a campaign at some church services, again undeterred by this. Zimbabweans are still going around on with their business. Yesterday, the president opened a women's bank, again in a full house, where Zimbabweans are still congregating in public areas. They're still congregating in large numbers. It means that the political programs of every party is going on. Today, Zimbabweans gathered together to sign a peace pledge for the elections. All parties did that. All presidential candidates did that. It basically shows that the resilience of the Zimbabwean people is on display.
Yeah.
We are still going ahead with our programs as if nothing has happened.
Yeah.
While the investigations are taking place in the background.
Yeah, very finally, if, and I don't like to speculate, but as you mentioned, if these could be remnants of the old status quo, the old regime, and they're trying to get rid of Mnangagwa and trying to stop him from revolutionizing Zimbabwe and transforming the society, and if they were behind the attempted poisoning and now this explosion, this assassination attempt, do you fear that they're going to keep on trying until they get it right?
They will keep on trying, and I hope they won't get it right. We expect the security services to do whatever it takes to protect the president, because he's citizen number one. Right now, he is what Zimbabwe needs. He is what has been prescribed for Zimbabwe by the doctors, so to speak. So if they succeed, that will be a disaster. And I hope and pray they will never succeed with this.
Nick Mangwana, it's been a pleasure having you on the Newsmakers. Thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Do remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, India imposes direct rule over its half of Kashmir. Did democracy fail in the disputed territory, or is the BJP trying to cover up human rights abuses? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.